Afternoon. We hope you have enjoyed your lunch today. At least there was lunch. So, an economy that works for people is the subject of the third public session to be held during our Utopia Week in Lisbon. The European Union's unique social market economy allows economies to grow and to reduce poverty and inequality. Small and medium enterprises are the backbone of the European Union's economy. It's essential to strengthen them, complete the capital markets union, and deepen the economic and monetary union. With Europe on a stable footing, the economy can fully respond to the needs of the European Union citizens, and this is one of the European Commission's 6 priorities for 2019 to 2024. To address these topics, we have Professor Pedro Brinca, an associate professor at Nova SBE, who has been involved in executive education programs and consulting projects at Economics for Policy and Nova Fine. Okay, something went wrong here. He's also collaborating with the Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, a think tank in Portugal, and this is today's Utopia Public Contribution for a Better Europe. Please welcome Pedro Brinca.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sara, for the nice introduction. My name is Pedro. I joined Nova in 2015. I was living in Florence, Italy, at the European University Institute. I got married. My wife was Portuguese. Let's just say that her bargaining power was stronger than mine at the time, so I was the one coming back. So I would need the slides, if that's possible. So what I prepared for today, there was also a little bit of a miscommunication in terms of the language. I will speak in English, but there's a lot of Portuguese in the slides. Not just Portuguese, but mostly it's Portuguese. But I mean, most of what I'm going to show you are essentially plots and images, so I don't think that's going to be an issue. If there's something that you want to know, please ask, okay? Now, this whole session is about you, right? I mean, I know what's in the slides, I made them, so feel free to ask questions and to make it about you, because it is about you, okay? So, this being said, I thought about talking about 2 topics that give kind of context to the times that we are living, and I'm going to tie them here and there with some of the challenges that Sara introduced just a while ago, namely, or mostly, inequality in terms of the impacts that some of these events have produced. Okay, so let's start the war in Ukraine. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not scientifically competent to give you a proper and adequate timeline for everything that has influenced the escalade to the war. But, as an interested person on these kind of topics and the impact that they have in today's society, I set up a short timeline in the last 10 years of what has been happening. So if you go back to February 2013, President Yanukovych rejected public demonstrations and for stronger integration with the West, okay? And that led to a lot of protests. There was like very strong movement of police repression. Things didn't go well. A lot of social unrest. And it was not, by chance that later in the year, President Yanukovych was no longer President Yanukovych, and he had to escape Ukraine, not to be, in danger. It was seen as pro-Russian, and the immediate answer for Ukraine kind of turning to the West was, you guessed it, the invasion of Crimea on behalf of Russia, after some local referendum that was heavily contested by international organizations. That gave them the motive shortly after all of these events to invade Crimea. Now, following that, a lot of independent movements start to rise in the Donbas region, namely Donetsk and Luhansk, with similar referenda, not recognized by the international community, but still a strong kind of movement for succession from Georgia to Russia. Now, what happened was that, as it always happens in these kind of conflicts, it's a proxy war, right? And, Russia starts supplying these independentist movements with weapons. Most of them had no military training. We're talking about militias. And one day they saw an airplane going through their airspace. They probably thought that it was the Ukrainian armed forces. And yeah, that didn't end up well. And over 200 people died after a commercial air flight from the Netherlands heading to Malaysia was shot down by these militias. Okay? So this kind of put it in international center of attention. And following this, we had the Minsk agreements, where the international community, namely European Union, France, you see Merkel, together with the Russian and the new leadership in Ukraine, trying to reach an agreement to end hostilities. But of course, even if in the paper there was kind of an ambitious agenda of kind of de-escalation, de-escalation didn't really happen. And what I'm showing you here, not in the same year, is a picture taken from one of the Ukrainian cities after they were the target of a cybernetic attack to shut down power plants. I mean, I've never been to Ukraine, but Ukraine in December with no heating probably is not the nicest place to be. So, yeah, that was kind of hardcore. Now, in response, NATO, or I shouldn't say in response, but following that, NATO started mobilizing troops for the Baltic countries and also for Poland. Baltic countries were especially important, and the reason is it's much harder, or as am I told, right? I'm no military kind of expert, but as I'm told, it's much harder to liberate a region than to defend it, okay? And, from the border of Russia to the capital of the Baltic states is like 2 hours. So you had to have preemptive strength, military strength on the ground to make sure that, to preempt some sort of idea of mobilization into these countries. Ukraine starts doing military exercises together with NATO in October 2018, and the UK, well, UK is part of NATO, and Russia starts mobilizing troops to the border of Ukraine, and shortly after, we get to February 2022, and we see tanks from Russia invading separatist regions, and 1 week later, they were on their way to Russia, okay? So this is just a short timeline of some main events in the last 10 years that kind of put a little bit of perspective into the dynamics of what happened. Here you have just a short summary of all of this. The fact is, we're talking about a conflict that has created more than 100,000 victims ever since 2014, and more than 8.2 million refugees just from February, okay? If you think that Ukraine has 40 million people, or had 40 million inhabitants before the conflict, we're talking about almost 25% of the population escaping the country. And in terms of aid, the US alone, in terms of military aid, about $78 billion in aid since 2014, most of it since February 2022. Now, thinking about the role of Europe and how it balances with Russia, I mean, Russia is the largest country in the world from a geographic perspective, right? It's about 4 times the size of European Union. But GDP-wise, or population-wise, they are much smaller, okay? About 3 times smaller, and they have strong demographic issues. They're aging really fast. And economically speaking, we're talking about 1/10 of the EU economy, okay? 1/10. So this is the idea. I mean, if you have 2 nuclear powers fighting against each other, right? Russia can blow the world 20 times. NATO can blow the world 50 times. I mean, you only need to blow up the world once, right? So it's a stalemate. The conventional war is not on the table. It's not an option, right? So I think this calls for alternative approaches. And I think the economic approach and the sanctions, though imperfect as they may be, take the conflict to an arena where there is no stalemate, where Europe is in a much better advantage, okay? So that's my perspective, at least. And you can see this. The GDP of the European Union is 10 times GDP of Russia. But not just that. Prior to starting the conflict, the EU represented almost 40% of all international trade of Russia. Russia represented around less than 5% of our international trade. Okay? The kind of stuff that we send, we, European Union, I'm assuming, the kind of stuff that we send to Russia is, to Russia is mainly, you know, machinery, transport equipment, medication, chemics, other manufactured goods. These are all stuff that are very dense from a technological perspective, with high value added, hard to substitute, okay? What do they send us? Raw materials, okay? Relatively easier to substitute apart from natural gas, and I'll get there, okay? And just to give another sense of perspective, we're talking about Europe representing 75% of all foreign direct investment in Russia at the onset of the conflict. Russia represented less than 2% of foreign direct investment in Europe. So the balance that you have on the military front from the fact that you have two nuclear powers, you know, confronting themselves, completely disappears on the economic landscape. I mean, Russia is a gas station in the middle of the forest, essentially, if you put it in perspective in this context, okay? Military issues aside. And that's why when the war started, okay, right there in February, of course it's a war, and it's a war in the heart of Europe, so stock markets were a little bit jittery. If you look at Dow Jones in the US, you had a decrease, a one-week decrease of 0.5 percentage point. Euronext 100 in Europe had a decrease of about almost 5%. So what was the impact in Russia? Let's see a segment in the news.
Сегодня Александр Бутманов, экономист, основатель инвестиционного клуба «Союзники», эксперт по биржевым стратегиям. Александр, здравствуйте.
Приветствую, добрый день, не говорю.
Да, никто уже сейчас не говорит. Биржевые стратегии сегодня это вообще атовизм или вы еще надеетесь в профессии остаться?
В крайнем случае я буду работать Дедом Морозом, как 25 лет назад.
Ну это раз в год только. Ну,
Кроме шуток, давайте быстренько я это сделаю. Я передаю привет Сергею Усиченко, который пил 12 лет назад, 13, за смерть фондового рынка. Сегодня я пью газировку. Дорогой фондовый рынок, ты был нам близок, был интересен. Покойся с миром, дорогой товарищ.
Я не буду комментировать этот флешмоб, не хочу, потому что я в это верить.
So what we saw in Russia was a collapse of the stock market. The stock market index, or the main stock market index, fell to about 40% of its previous value in the first week alone. And basically they closed the stock market to prevent it from falling further. Of course, the stock market eventually reopened. These kind of indexes recovered, but the liquidity and the indexes don't convey the same information they did before. I mean, a lot of companies left Russia, so you can't really compare. So the hit is pretty strong. But of course, I mean, I'm telling you this story about this proportion of forces between European Union and Russia on the economic front. But this, of course, is neglecting a major factor, which was natural gas. So at the start of this conflict, European Union imported about 40% of all our natural gas from Russia through mostly Nord Stream 1. Okay? So this left us in a vulnerable position, more so because of the prior history to what had been happening. We had a very strong and ambitious, and rightly so, agenda of, you know, decarbonization, switching off from coal and nuclear in some cases. In Germany, they shut down nuclear after the Fukushima events, still with Angela Merkel. And that only increased our dependency of natural gas to cover the deficit for electricity in the European markets. Okay? So when we say, oh, the war kind of spiked the prices of energy. Well, yeah, it accelerated, but it has been on the rise. It had been on the rise since February 2021, okay? So it had been on the rise from before. And people say, oh, inflation started with the war. Well, not really true. In January, in Portugal, for example, we already had 3.3% inflation, just 0.7 below what it is this month, okay? So, and in February, just before the war, right? Because the National Statistics Office collects data up to 16th of February for the inflation of February, and the war only started on February 22nd or 23rd. Inflation was already 4.4%, above what it is now in Portugal. So, yeah, energy was a major factor, and the war in Ukraine and the fact that Putin started using energy as a strategic weapon in this proxy war kind of put everyone on alert. Okay? So these are the physical flows of natural gas through Nord Stream, and all of a sudden, after June, when it became obvious how much support, including military, Ukraine was getting from the West, all of a sudden some technical problems start appearing on Nord Stream, right? So, and it started flowing gas to Europe. And, you know, international markets in natural gas became so fragile and so unstable that one single explosion in a producing facility in Texas, just that, one facility in Texas got a problem and they got like an explosion. That was that was enough to increase natural gas in all of Europe for by 20%, okay? Just for a short period. So, all of this, of course, hides a very heterogeneous reality. Some countries like Portugal had a very small exposure to Russian gas, maybe about 3%, 2%, and it was mainly indirect exposure. And some countries like Hungary have a 95% dependence of Russian gas. 95% of their gas came from Russia. European average was 40%, but Germany, for example, depended 55% of all their gas imports from Russia. So this was a big deal, okay? This was a big deal at the time. And it was such a big deal that everyone was panicking about rationing energy, about the winters that, you know, when the winter came, what we were going to do. We're talking about, you know, again, energy rationing, industry shutdown, because if you're going to shut down energy consumption, you'll do it in the industry. You won't do it for households, otherwise you have a revolution. And so everyone was kind of panicking by May, June, and into the summer. But what you observed, and I don't think in the media people talk about this enough. I guess bad news are always more salient than good news. But something spectacular happened in Europe in this last year. And this something spectacular that I'm talking about is the fact that Europe was able to diversify not just the origin of the energy that was using. So we diversified oil imports away from Russia. That was easy. I mean, you know, the kind of distribution channels through which we get oil were there, and there were alternatives. But natural gas, not so much, right? But still, we were able to do it. And what you see here in the plot, in the light blue, are the imports of liquefied natural gas vis-a-vis, the flows into Europe of liquefied natural gas, like the boats that you see in the picture, vis-a-vis the imports of gas from Russia in dark blue. Okay? Just for you to have an idea of the capacity of economies to adapt, Germany, in February, depended, as I said, 55% of all their imports of natural gas from Russia. They started a very ambitious program of adapting the ports in the North Sea to receive liquefied natural gas from Norway, from Qatar, from the US. And by May, they imported from Russia, even before the Nord Stream pipeline started having technical problems, they were dependent on Russian gas by less than 30%, just in a couple of months, okay? So that was how strongly we were able to deal with this challenge. Now, in May, amidst all the panic of we're going to have to ration energy in the winter, the European Parliament passed a legislation that obliged all countries with capacity for holding reserves of natural gas to fill them up to 80% by November 1st. And everyone on the newspaper said, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. Nord Stream just closed. We reached that limit by August 18th. And by October 18th, we had all our reserves filled by 92% across the European Union. Okay? So much so that in yellow, you have the average level of natural gas reserves in Europe, and with a confidence interval from observations between 2017 and 2021. It's strongly seasonal. And why is that? Because in the winter, everyone uses energy for heating. That's the main reason. The fact is, 2023, first winter without Nord Stream pumping gas into Europe, and we are way above the average of gas storage from previous years. So much so that natural gas prices now are below what they were before the war. Very so much so that, you know, just 3 months ago, we had dozens of boats full with natural gas in Europe just queuing to unload natural gas, and nobody knew what to do with it. Never underestimate an economy's power to adapt, okay? It's very easy to be an analyst and say, okay, you know, we have, you know, I don't know, natural gas from Ukraine is 55% of energy, or 40% of energy in Europe. You take down natural gas from Russia, all of a sudden we have half the energy in Europe. Not quite. People respond to incentives, okay? And people adapt. And that's what we've shown. Extraordinary resilience and capacity to adaptation, diversifying both the origin of the energy, but also the type of energy. All of a sudden, we were converting ovens that use natural gas to diesel, okay? All of a sudden, some companies were relocating physically production facilities to geographies where gas supply wasn't an issue. All of a sudden, the Russian gas was no longer relevant, okay? So I would say this is quite a big achievement that Europe managed to achieve, for which people don't give enough credit. We were making predictions that Germany would contract 3 to 10% GDP this year. I mean, they're at 0%. I mean, they slow down, of course, but very far from the catastrophic predictions of 10% contraction, okay? So I would say this is a big win for Europe and our capacity to mobilize, or for the utopia we're trying to build, right? So, inflation. These two covers aged well, right? So these are the covers of Bloomberg and The Economist in 2019. So if there are two covers that don't age well from magazines, I think these would be strong candidates for the first position. Just a few months later, we were starting to see inflation indeed starting to rise. And as you see, inflation was already strongly on the rise before 2022. So yes, the war kind of put it on steroids, but we're already with an inflation crisis in our hands, mostly driven by a strong climb in energy prices, okay? Now, I know economists don't have a good reputation. I mean, we are credited to have correctly predicted 10 out of the last 3 recessions. But, you know, this time, I guess, we should be given some credit, because every economist kind of predicted that we would have strong inflation in this period. And here are the arguments for it. Well, first, you know, COVID crisis was a sanitary crisis. Unlike 2008, there was nothing wrong with the economy. It was a sanitary crisis. Some Chinese guy who ate a half-baked bat and then everyone got sick. But, you know, this has nothing to do with the economy, right? So once the sanitary part of the economy is controlled, or sanitary dimension is controlled, and if we had the policies in place to prevent the massive destruction of companies and jobs, which we did, maybe we even overdid it, and maybe that's part of the story for why we have strong inflation, then you should expect a very strong recovery, okay? Especially in terms of purchasing power or willingness to spend, especially after, having stayed 1 or 2 years locked in your place. All of a sudden, the gates open, everyone wants to go outside and spend their money. But guess what? Supply chains are still kind of recovering, and there's not enough production of goods for everyone. So what happened to prices? They go up, okay? So we've kind of been alerting to that for a while. But also, as I said, maybe the support given to the economy was too much. I mean, I was on the record. I tend to comment on economic events a little bit in the media. And I'm on record in 2020 criticizing the Portuguese government for not doing enough to help the economy. And boy, was I wrong. Portugal was indeed one of the countries that spent the least supporting the economy. That was true. But maybe it was the right one, at least on average, okay? And that will lead to the talk about economy working for everyone on the last part of the lecture or the talk. But on average, Portugal spent around 2.5% of GDP with direct aid to the economy. Germany spent close to 10%. US, 12%. Okay, Germany, France, 6%. We were by far some of the, amongst the countries who spent the least supporting the economy. And I was there, front row, criticizing the government for doing so. But guess what? They were right. Okay. My feeling today is that the aid to the economy was too much. Now, if this crisis had happened in 2008, it would have been a very different story. I don't think that would be the institutional activism, the jumping to the front line with all the policy guns blazing to intervene in the economy. Because in 2008, just prior to the Great Recession, there wasn't this institutional feeling that, public institutions could intervene in the economy in such an efficient or such a drastic way. But guess what? After 2008, a lot of the policies and a lot of the strong interventions, government interventions, and central banks interventions were deemed as very successful in bringing the economy from the rubble. 2011, sovereign debt crisis. How did it all end? Mario Draghi saying we will do whatever it takes to save the euro. That alone, without any specific intervention, he was talking about OMTs, which is this financial mechanism that institutions now have. It was created shortly after to support any European country in difficulties in terms of the budget. It was never used until today. But just Mario Draghi coming in saying, we will do whatever it takes, and creating the OMTs, just for the fact that they existed, even though they were never used, that alone ended the sovereign debt crisis. All the crazy premia on sovereign debt disappeared, okay? So there was a strong feeling that, institutions can do a lot to promote welfare and to cushion all these big shocks in the economy. And maybe we had the crisis of overconfidence during COVID. I mean, it is true, big victory, no job destruction, no business destruction, at least not relevant for a crisis of this size. It's good to remind that in August, or in the second quarter of 2020, Portuguese economy alone contracted at a rate of 16%. I mean, largest single quarter drop in the history of the country, or at least the recorded history of the country. But yeah, we were able to avoid that. But maybe we went too far with all the support and all the aid. So all of this predicted that we would have an inflation crisis. What we did not predict was how big it would be. So what you see in this plot, in the bars, or in the bubbles, are inflation predictions from economists on December 2021. And what you see in the bars is what actually happened. Huge difference. Of course, this is war in Ukraine. Now, yes, right? That's the big difference that nobody knew in December 2021, and that happened in 2022, but, it doesn't explain Costa Rica. I don't think Costa Rica is very worried about Ukraine. So, there was a huge underestimation on behalf of economists of the impact of inflation. Okay? So much so that the Daily Mirror, more worried typically with Prince Andrew's misadventures, was more interested in making the front cover about inflation than the royal family. Okay? So that's how big it became. So now there's a big discussion, big policy debate of whether this is more about supply side or demand side, and it's very politicized, this debate, right? Because if it's a supply side story, raising interest rates to control inflation won't bring more gas from Russia. It won't make shipping containers arriving faster from China. It's a physical kind of technological constraint. Raising interest rates won't be so much of help to deal with that. But if it's a demand side, if you buy into the story that governments and central banks printed too much money and had too large deficits, and that is also part of the story, then yes, raising interest rates is the right policy. And they should have been, they should be raised in order to rein on inflation. But as in everything, there's never a straight answer to most economic questions, right? And it is both supply and demand. And it was supply and demand even before Ukraine, which is the data that you're looking. So this is a paper by some economists from the International Monetary Fund. Per Nicholas, the second one was Niels Jakob, sorry. The second one was my PhD colleague when I studied in Stockholm. And they tried to measure, you know, technically it's a very complicated thing to do, but they tried to do that. And what you see here in black, okay, is the contribution to industrial production fluctuations and then for producer price index fluctuations. So both channels put together, you see on the right panel that inflation was on the rise, correct? The blue lines say how much of it is because people, firms and governments have excessive spending power, and how much of it was lack of the economy's capability to produce goods and services. And as you can see, both factors have a role. Now you could say this is before the war in Ukraine, but here you get after the war in Ukraine started, right? And up to the summer, and this is first one is Eduardo Gonçalves, a former student from Nova. He works at the ECB. So this is an ECB paper where they show that even both in industry and services, and we're talking about industry on the left panel, we're talking about non-energy intensive goods. Okay? Non-energy intensive. So it's not just about energy. What you see is that both the green, supply shocks, and the blue, demand shocks, again, play a role. So it's as much a story about disruptions in supply chains as it was a story of maybe overreaching policy that put too much money on the hands of governments, firms, and people on average. Okay. Now, of course, if you and me, if we have 2 chicken and I eat the 2 of them, I'm going to be very full, you're going to be very hungry. But on average, each one of us ate 1 chicken, right? So averages are what they are, averages. And very often that dimension gets missed. Take inflation, for example. How much is inflation in Portugal? Well, at the beginning of the year, it was, well, at the end of last year, it was around 10%, 7%, 5%, now 4%. But that's an average. That's an average. What were the goods that increased most prices? Well, energy, food, housing. Who spends most of their income on those 3 items? Poor people. So if you look at the inflation rate of poor people, the actual inflation rate, how much prices increased for these people, their inflation rate is way above the inflation rate that comes in the news. Way above. Okay? So there's a very strong redistributionary effect from inflation. And of course, this calls for targeted policies. Okay? And I'm going to talk about those. That will be the end of the lecture. That calls for targeted policies. Of course, let's not be naive. The reason why the ECB raises interest rates is to take purchasing power away from families, from governments and from firms, okay? There's no ambiguity in that. But of course, no fight against inflation can justify a family which cannot put food on the table, provide for shelter, or send their kids to school. Those people need to be helped. It hurts the fight against inflation, yes, but as a society we have a social pact that we don't accept that those things can happen, and we should, okay, well, it's a political statement, but in my view, we should collect taxes and help those people, okay? The problem is that when we don't do that, but I'll get to that. So as you can see here, food, bread and cereals, and meat, they're all much more predominant, more important, have a much higher weight in the budget of households with little income, to the left, as compared to households with more income. And if you think that's obvious for food, take water, take electricity, same pattern. This is, by the way, a paper also from colleagues of mine here from Nova. That's Susana Peralta. She appears a lot on TV commenting all these things. And two former PhD students from Nova, they graduated, I think, already. Mariana, I'm not sure, but Bruno graduated already too. And look at shelter, housing. So for the top 20% of households, what they spent with housing is less than 5% of their income on average. But if you look at the 20% poorest, it's way over 20%. Again, one of the items where prices increase the most. So you can see here how different the impact is and how dangerous, just looking at the average can be, right? So after all these great predictions that I share with you from economists, if you're still interested to know what we think is going to happen, here's the last nail in the coffin. So what you see here in black are inflation that was observed both in the US and in Europe. And in the light blue lines are the predictions at each point in time of the European Central Bank, which, by the way, is the entity responsible for controlling these things, and the Federal Reserve Board in the US. Okay? So at each point in time, ECB kept expecting inflation to go up, and guess what? It never did. So of course, you should ask yourselves, why should we believe the ECB? I mean, they doesn't seem to be able to get anything right, right? So predicting inflation has been quite complicated. And, I could spend hours talking about the methodological issues that are connected to the way that these people do these kind of forecasts. But I'll save you from that. What I'm going to tell you is more of a structural analysis to what I think is going to happen. So one of the reasons why we had such large inflation was that during COVID, we had some of the largest deficits in the history of many countries. And most of this money, right, most of these bonds that government had to print in order to be able to sustain, the big deficits were purchased by yours truly, the European Central Bank. Okay, effectively monetizing the debt and throwing billions and billions and billions at the economy. Okay? Now you could ask, we also did that in the Great Recession. Why didn't we have an inflation crisis? Well, remember, in 2008, 2011, what we had was a financial crisis. A big part of the problem was that most banks were undercapitalized. Their balance sheets were too fragile. So what did we do? We increased strongly the macroprudential requirements, the requirements that banks had to comply in terms of liquidity, in terms of cash, in terms of high-quality assets. Long story short, we printed a lot of money too, yes, but it did not end in Main Street. It ended in Wall Street in the bank's balance sheets. No pressure on prices. Nobody was using that money to buy cars, to buy energy, to buy whatever. It was there in the balance sheets. I mean, we still see it today, right? I mean, Portuguese banks, Caixa Geral de Depósitos, the biggest bank in Portugal, 80 million in deposits. only 39 million or 47 million in credit. They're swimming in cash. That's why they don't raise the interest rates on deposits, right? So, but that ended in July. No more money for governments. So ECB stopped purchasing of new sovereign debt from July last year. So that was a big factor. That kind of went away. Government deficits start to narrow and converging to very small values. Interest rates start rising a lot all over the world. And this has obviously two effects. Money is much more expensive, which means if I want to borrow to buy something, now I think twice, right? And second, we are rewarding people more strongly if they put savings in the financial system. So those two channels make, or at least in theory, makes us expect that inflation is going to go down. Okay, so there's hope. That's the message. And if you look at commodity prices, right, everything is kind of crashing. Wheat, right, 25% of it came from Ukraine and Russia prior to the war. 25% of the world supply of wheat came from these two markets. What we have, prices are already at pre-war levels. What about natural gas? Our baby star of the day. Again, below pre-war prices. Oil, also at, average levels. Coal, again, big hike, coming down very fast. Remember, this is not inflation. This is the price level. So what you see to the right of each peak is deflation. It's prices going down. Okay? It's not prices slowing down. It's prices going down, effectively. Here you have ammonium, which is a strong component to make fertilizers for agricultural use. Here we have cement, a bit on the rise because of China and the heating up of China again, and huge investment in construction. Cement has been a bit more unstable. If we look at German electricity, remember there was supposed to be rationing. Where's the rationing? Nowhere. I mean, you have electricity below pre-war levels. What about iron? Again, there was a peak in 2022, again, below. Disruption of supply chains. So the graph in the middle, you have the time that shipping containers took through the East Pacific route, or the Trans-Pacific eastbound route, and the Far East westbound route. Yes, we have a peak with the pandemic. It took a lot of time for shipping containers to arrive. There were no shipping containers, by the way. The plot immediate to the right gives you the prices of those shipping containers. One shipping container in the middle of the pandemic cost as much as 25,000 euros just to rent it. Now it's below 4,000. I mean, supply chain disruptions are kind of on the go. We can't blame them much longer for inflation at all. In Germany, producer prices are going down. We're not talking about inflation that is lower. We're talking about deflation. We're talking about prices going down. And part of the story of inflation in Europe had to do a lot also with the fact that the euro was losing value against the dollar. And why was that? Well, part of the story was that the ECB started raising interest rates much later than the Fed. Now, you take your money where they give you more for it, so everyone taking money to the US because interest rates were higher, that leads to a fall of the euro. Why is that an issue? Because we import a lot of stuff. So everything that we import becomes more expensive, and we start having imported inflation, especially energy, okay? Like oil and others. But that kind of inverted, and the euro started gaining value again. So maybe that's also good news. And maybe we might have a new storm, well, not in Portugal, but in many other markets, which has to do with real estate, right? If you look at New Zealand, in green is how much prices went up. In orange, how much prices went down after the peak. And in red, the predictions until the summer of this year. Okay? That's Germany, that's Canada, Australia, Germany, United States, and Britain. Okay? And if you think that the balance sheets of many banks are full of mortgages. Maybe this kind of story, rings a bell. Mortgages, banks, house prices going down, people defaulting, banks getting into trouble. I mean, 2008 is not back, okay? Unlike some of the sneakers from the 80s. But there's a strong kind of fear, or there's a lot of attention being paid to make sure that, these markets are anchored. Now, I want to call you the attention for two things here. I'm sorry for being in Portuguese, but actually it's in English. Yeah, that's good. That was fortunate. So, in February, for you guys to have an idea what it means, this hike in interest rates. One family that could put 900 euros on the side to buy a house, with Euribor at 6 months plus 1% spread, they would pay an interest rate of 0.5%. They would buy a house of 300,000 euros and pay a mortgage of 900 euros. Fast forward 1 year, that mortgage payment went from 900 to 1,471. Now it's above 1,550. Okay? That's how much in trouble a lot of these people got into, right? Especially people who borrowed money to buy houses at the end of the decade, beginning of the new decade, because that's when they have the most capital still to be paid, less margin to extend the mortgage and lower the monthly payment, right? And that's when they feel the strongest the impact of interest rates. But here's another thing, and this is what's getting everyone concerned. Same slide, by the way. The family that 1 year ago had 900 euros on the side could buy a 300,000 euro house. The same family who has still 900 euros on the side, what is the house that they can buy now? So it's a fall of 40% in purchasing power, okay? And it's worse than this because this is only until February. Now it's maybe 50% fall, okay? And guess what? Income didn't even stay the same. In real terms, people in 2022 lost purchasing power. Here I want to say people who work for a third party, who live from their wage. I'm not talking about capital gains, I'm talking about labor earnings, okay? Which is the majority of the population, okay? So not only they are able to buy a much cheaper house with the same amount, they didn't even keep the same amount. And disposable income explains 40% of all variation in house prices across developed economies. 40% is explained by disposable income. So if it contracted about to the tune of 40 or 50%, you understand why a lot of people are scared of the real estate markets, right? So Portugal is an extraordinary country. So even with, it goes completely against the trend. I mean, it would take 2 hours for us to understand why. And you don't want to know, I can tell you. But in Portugal, the supply of housing fell in the beginning of the year around, or in the last quarter of 2022 alone, fell close to 20%. Okay? This, at least in Portugal, is one of the reasons why prices are not going down, because supply of new houses is falling, and it keeps falling. But that's not what's happening in most other countries, okay? Now, to end, there was this policy that the government, that the Prime Minister in December said it didn't make sense, that we should lower the taxes on food items, some food items, to 0%, from 6% to 0%, okay? This was a measure that the Prime Minister thought it was stupid in December. And this is the evolution of the price of basic food items from January to December 2022, 2023. So yeah, it is correct. Prices have been going up a lot, but they were falling since March. So in December, the government thought it was stupid. And then when they start falling, the government thought, well, maybe now it's a good time to, lower taxes on food items. Now, it is true that a lot of people start blaming the distribution sector, and in some cases, I think rightly so. But on average, most of the increase in prices of production goods came from the producer. Energy was much more expensive. Fertilizers were more, in some industries, fertilizers are like 90 or 70% of the total production cost. And rations and stuff like that. And that's very intensive in energy. Okay? So most of the increase in prices came from the production sector, not the distribution. So here's the three parties signing the agreement. Gonçalo Lopes Xavier for the distribution sector, our Prime Minister, and Eduardo something, I can't remember his name, Costa, I think, from the agricultural producer sector. Now, the idea is to lower the sales tax on 44 categories of goods, okay? And the idea was that, these are the 44 goods that the Department of Health thinks that are better for Portuguese. And what the distributors and the producers agreed was to reflect the fall in the sales tax into the price. Okay? So that was the plan that they signed. Now, what I think it was, why did I agree with the Prime Minister in December that it was a stupid idea, and then I did not agree with the Prime Minister in March or April when he thought about this? Well, first, and this is more of a political standpoint, I think it's very paternalistic from the government to tell me what I should or should not eat, right? If you like sea bass, you're in luck because, sea bass got a drop of price. But if you like robalo, I don't know the word in English, I'm sorry. It's a very similar fish, sea bass, or dorada, so bream, right? Sea beam or something. Well, two fish, very similar. One has a tax reduction, the other doesn't. If you like melon, great for you because now you pay 6% less, or better put, if you like watermelon, great for you because now you pay 6% less, but if you like melon, then you're unlucky because you don't get the tax reduction. Yeah. Anyway, so this leads to distortions in markets, in production, in all of these things, and this is very inefficient, not just to say that for me, from a political standpoint, I think it's kind of infantilizing. This measure costs to the public, to the budget, €500 million, 500 million euros that was used. Now, two things could have happened. The first is, it goes well. The policy has exactly the effect that it was intended to have. Okay? So that was the good outcome. If that happens, it's terrible. Why is it terrible? What the government is doing in an inflation crisis is what? Giving money to people. You don't fight an inflation crisis giving money to people. Okay? That's the complete opposite of what the ECB is trying to do, which is take money away from people. So that doesn't make any sense. But of course, you tell me, but Pedro, a lot of people are striving to keep food on the table. Yes. So those are the ones we should help. So we should take that $500 million and send it to the people who are actually in social deprivation. And if you had done that, if you had taken that €500 million and divided to the 3 million households in Portugal that are beneficiaries of the social tariff of electricity, or in one way or the other receive some sort of social support, instead of being able to save €8 per month, which is what this gave them, they would have gotten maybe €100 per month. This is a regressive measure. People who spend a lot of money, people who are wealthier, they saved a lot more from that $500 million, which is everyone's money, than the poor people. So if anything, it goes completely against what it should be done. So yes, I agree with the Prime Minister in December, this was stupid, okay? But that if the measure goes well, because it might go wrong. And if the 6% drop in the tax would correspond to a 6% drop in the price, that was the good scenario, which was still bad because it's a regressive measure and it's completely stupid in inflation. But what the literature says is that it's very seldomly the case. Most often what happens is part of those 6% is going to be opportunistically grabbed by either the distribution or the producer. Every cent of those 6% which is not reflected in the price is money from everyone going to the pockets of the distribution, which is having record profits, and the producers, which are not having record profits, but still. So this is what happened in Spain when they did that, from December to January. In some goods, okay, you had a high pass-through. A drop in the tax led to a proportional drop in the price. But in some goods, very low. In oil, food oils, it was what? 40%. So tax goes down by 6, prices go down by 2. The difference, pockets for the distribution. Okay? But don't take just Spain. Look at Finland. So the government in Finland some years ago decided to lower the value-added tax on hairdressers, but not on beauty salons. Go figure, had no idea. I mean, they did have a female prime minister, so maybe she had some leverage on that. I don't know. So this gave us, economists, the perfect ground to do some sort of natural experiment. So I'm saying the authors, followed how prices evolved and compared between beauty salons and hairdressers, which are in very similar markets, right? And guess what? Well, first, the value-added tax dropped 14%, right? The elimination of the value-added tax was 14% down. Prices only went down by 7%. So half of it did not go to the consumer, stayed in the hairdressers. But it got worse, because over time, that difference became smaller and smaller, to the point that in January 2012, this started in January 27, in January 2012, the difference between the prices in beauty salons and hairdressers was much smaller than the 7% drop at the beginning. And then when they reinstated the value added, when they brought again 14% and equalized just like it was before, what happened? Hairdressers increased the price more than they had increased if there was no temporary cut. So they even made it worse. So that's what the literature is telling us. Okay? So that's why I thought it was very, very stupid. We need to be very smart the way we spend money, public money. We should not fight ECB's policies. Otherwise, they are raising interest rates. We fight it, giving money to people. Prices don't go down. They raise even more the interest rates, and everyone gets even more in trouble. I mean, but of course, we cannot let people in social deprivation fall into that nightmare, and we need to help those even if that's counterproductive in terms of inflation, okay? So thanks a lot. You know, academics, and I guess most of you are also academics, are people who devote all their lives to know a lot about a very small part of the world. So when anyone shows interest, for us it's Christmas. So I'm very informal. If you want to approach me on social networks or whatever, if you want to sign my YouTube channel, after 1,000 subscribers, I start getting money for each click, so, you know. And yeah, thanks a lot for your patience, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Pedro Brinca is also a TV star in Portugal, so you might want to find him on CNN, or I don't know where you are right now, on many other topics. Thank you very much for being here with us. If you have any questions, we have the mics around, so please feel free.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. Again, Christmas? You're my former student, aren't you?
Okay.
Used to be my student, didn't?
No, I don't study in Portugal. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Then you're very similar to a former
I'm
student of
a
mine.
NASEC student.
It's the light, maybe. Yeah. Tell me.
So my question is, aren't these changes in VAT regulated?
What do you mean?
Like, if the VAT is supposed to go down by, if there's a decrease of 14%, shouldn't there be a decrease in prices in 14%? And that
By
should
law?
be, yeah.
No.
No, in the case of the hairdressers,
No.
it's not regulated.
I mean, prices are market prices.
yeah, okay.
I mean, if you're, let's say you're Pingdos, right? Just to put a bullet in our sponsors at NovSV. So, if you're Pingdos and you're selling rice, you stop charging 6% VAT to your client, but you can increase the price. There's no law against that. No, this is not North Korea. Yet. You're welcome.
Any more questions from the audience?
And just to answer on top of that, so here's the thing. When we analyze these things, we tend to look at the relative market power of whoever enters the transaction, right? The structure of distribution, especially, supermarkets in Portugal, is that we don't have that many competitors, and we have a lot of consumers. So, and we're talking about goods, food staples, or food items, which are very rigid from our perspective, right? If they change the price, the quantity that we stop purchasing is smaller than the proportional increase in the price. So they have more market power, so it was not hard to predict what could happen. Yes?
Hello. You know me already, Arlette.
I see the lights, I'm not sure.
Arlette.
Oh, Arlette, sorry, I'm completely blind by the lights.
Okay, talking about Portugal's case and what we were talking about, decreasing the VAT or taxes, for 6% to 0% on the what we call essential food, which is not essential, some of them. But the theory is, and I think what will happen as a practice is, once this is over, this tax-free thing, is that we will have the prices that were before are increased.
That would be consistent with what we saw with
Exactly.
hairdressers and beauty salons.
So, sorry, lack of a better word. The government knows these studies, the government knew about this situation in the countries, and still they did this. Do you have any explanation for this? Do you have any knowledge or understanding of why
I do,
this
but
theory
I cannot
could
say it
happen?
in public. I actually talked with the Secretary of State about this, and I can't tell you, at least not in
Okay.
public, what was the answer.
But so basically, we know by example that it won't work, but we do it anyway. So we're
Yeah.
dummies.
Politics, maybe.
Okay.
Yes, hi. So, Andrei Gubina, University of Ljubljana. Thank you for your really
Beautiful city.
interesting
Been there.
presentation. The question regarding the inflation. So, you've shown us how the prices of various commodities have gone up, gone down. You've shown us how the European Central Bank is projecting again and again, and then it's going down and it's projecting up again. I'm an electrical engineer, so but my understanding about inflation is that it's has a lot to do with people's perception of where it's going to go. So all those upward curves that were slightly blue on your slide and never materialized, and the one from 2019 that's going up in red, again, it's showing us the some expectations, because if we think the inflation is not going to go up, it's not going to go up, even if we put all the money in the. So? There could be various explanations regarding this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, that's the expectations channel is something that is super important, and it's at the very heart of everyone's concerns. And well, first, this is data up to 2019, and central banks have a problem, right? Which is credibility. So they cannot predict anything other than a convergence to the target inflation. Otherwise, what the hell are they doing, right? They can't do their job. So that's one part. So maybe I believe, I mean, I worked at ECB in the past. Maybe they don't really believe the inflation is going to be this one, but these are their statistical projections. But this is just me, wondering. That's the first thing. The second thing is expectations are crucial. If people believe prices are going to go up, if firms believe energy costs, whatever, are going to go up, they're going to make their wage demands, they're going to make their prices for the year go up, anticipating what they think is going to happen. And even if that didn't happen in the first place, this will generate inflation by itself. So we need to make sure that inflation expectations are anchored to the target, just like ECB. And modern banks, central banks, have been able to do it. So you go to Sweden, who started the inflation rate targeting of 2% in 1993, and by 1997, every single kind of survey and consultation of expectations was anchored to the 2%. But guess what? In Sweden, inflation for 20 years has been 1.6%. But you ask every Swede, how much is inflation going to be? He's going to tell you 2%. Trust in institutions is crucial. So I think that we are going through an era where people have very strong beliefs in the economic institutions. And that is a capital of goodwill, and in this case, for sure, that has helped them in their mission, okay? And if you look at expectations, and we can measure those things, we can compare prices of bonds versus prices of bonds which are indexed to inflation. And then the difference in the price tells us what financial markets think inflation is going to be. So at 2 years horizon, all of these different ways of measuring expectations point to 2% inflation. Yep. So on that dimension, we're safe. Now, the danger is, because economists have been saying that inflation was temporary for a year, 2 years now, right? So some point there's the danger that people stop believing. And then we have a much stronger problem at our hands. So let's hope that doesn't happen. That inflation is going to come down fast enough such that expectations are not an issue.
Because we jump over that 2% long-term target, and then we're in an uncharted territory. Or I come from their generation that lived through the hyperinflation before the breakup of Yugoslavia. So yeah, this is where there was no trust in any of the...
When I ask students in my second year macro course, do you know what is hyperinflation? How much do you think inflation rate gets to? Oh, 20%, 50%. And then I show them, Germany in the between wars period of 28,000%. Or people effectively using money to light the stove because matches were more expensive than a 10,000 marks bill. So they can't understand how the social fabric of the economy quickly collapses in hyperinflation. And this is not a thing of the past. Go to Venezuela, right? If you want to buy a package of diapers, you have to take like 2 bags full of bills. So, yeah.
Yeah, but it's on a different topic, so it's a follow-up question. It's okay. Mine is on a different topic.
Well, my question is also about the inflation, actually. You pointed at a very antisocial effect of the inflation phenomenon.
Yeah.
My question is, to what extent there is a responsibility of, let's say, monetary policy on the European level for that, because there was a relief in monetary policy, high public spendings during the COVID crisis, and in fact this, I think, was very antisocial if there is an, let's say, direct or indirect effect on the inflation.
So 2 things about that. The first is, so central banks started their history with the responsibility of looking at price stability. Okay? Actually, that's not 100% correct. At the very origin, at the beginning of the century in the US, it was also for financial stability. But then it came the 80s, right? And you had like this huge inflation, huge for what we know, right? 20%, 15, 20% inflation. and following the stagflation of the 70s and the 80s. So price stability was the mantra, right? Price stability, price stability, price stability. And one of the big conquests was that central banks are independent from the political system, and because they were independent, they could do, like the Volcker in the US, they could actually do the policies that were needed without the political pressure to bring down inflation. That was seen as a big victory of the concept of independent central banks. Now, what we've seen since the 80s is people start asking maybe, I don't know, that's my opinion, too many things from the central banks. So now not only they have to look after inequality, they have to look after climate change, they have to look after, racial inequality. I mean, that's, for me, I think that's very dangerous because they are not an elected authority. Those kind of decisions, especially redistribution decisions, should be left to the parliament and the people. They should not be taking decisions by technocrats, unelected technocrats. But, it is what it is. It's a fashion. I mean, if you're interested on that topic, I mean, it is in Portuguese, but you can go to my website. I just wrote an article in the newspaper maybe 4 months ago about this trend of asking too much from unelected institutions, namely the ECB. And I'm totally empathetic with the idea that maybe we are asking too much from central banks. The second thing I want to say very quickly is that right now, the biggest danger are the political pressures on the ECB. Because, I mean, we see it. We see governments all over Europe with populist measures spreading money. I mean, our prime minister put a check on the mail of 125 euros to 90% of the population to fight inflation. That's trying to put down a fire with gasoline. I mean, it's totally on the manuals of what you should not do. But, and then, of course, they come to TV saying that the ECB should not keep rising the interest rates. I mean, our president said that on national television. So we're going through times where there's a lot of political pressure on the ECB, and it's sure a test of the resilience of our institutions.
Yes, I have a question on a different topic. It's more curiosity. So, Rita Falcão from Nova. So I was wondering, because you gave an explanation about the war in Ukraine, based on political events. But
I'm not a political scientist.
Yeah,
Remember
I know. But I was thinking about the pandemic, was it a coincidence? Because it was right after the pandemic.
So I think the conflict in Ukraine, again, don't fly on the technology of what I'm about to say, because I'm not competent to talk about this.
My question was about, was there a more economic cause or
I don't think it was an economic cause. I think it was an imperialistic kind of, old Soviet Union, old Russia, big Russia. They have an expression for... Well, mother is... No, it's another expression like the... Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't matter. What I think happened was that, way before the war, there was already a movement of Europe doing the decarbonization, and we needed more gas, not to raise prices in Europe of electricity. And we had talks with Russia to increase the supply of gas. And they could make more money with it. They didn't want to expand it. There was the talks about Nord Stream 2, but still, they were very kind of reticent in increasing supply of gas to Europe. And in my opinion, I think Putin saw Europe in a fragility position, especially because of I think he overstepped not only his military prowess of thinking that he could blitzkrieg Ukraine in 3 days, but also the kind of economic hurt that he could put into us. And to be honest, I mean, I'm no political scientist, once again, I think he kind of miscalculated. And if he could go back, I think he wouldn't have done what he did. Because now, I mean, he will supply India and China. If it wasn't for India or China, Russia would have collapsed probably by now. But he will export to Russia and India, to China and India, but it takes a lot of money. They don't pay as well as we do. And, there are other political issues with India and Russia and China. The pandemic, maybe it exponentiated the hardships that were being taken in Europe, and Russia thought that, they could take advantage of that. I don't know. Again, that's a lot of political science that I don't feel competent to talk much about. Is that all? Okay, thanks a lot. Really nice meeting you.
So thank you very much. We hope you have enjoyed this session. Tomorrow in the same room from 9 to 1 p.m., from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., we will have our last keynote session organized with the Network of Women in Diplomacy, with the presence of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and many, many members, female members of the Portuguese diplomatic body from South Africa, Belgium, France, and now I can recall the others. So it would be really interesting to count with your presence. And since this, and one special remark, this specific session was, the network is doing all the dissemination towards the session, and it's a session in collaboration not with Nova, but with Utopia. The logos are there, so it's an important transference or dissemination action from Utopia. So thank you very much for your presence once again.